Yeah, okay.
It's visible.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. So, we have my case study is El Salvador, and we'll be starting off with the election and the events that followed the elections and led to the elections so that we can analyze the parameters more in depth. So, let me begin with the title because it already gives away the central argument of the presentation. This is not about asking whether El Salvador physically held elections in the 1980s. It did, but the central argument is that people went to the police stations, ballot were cast, parties competed, and the results were announced. Foreigners also observed it, but newspapers and television's reporters showed citizens standing in long lines. So the election image was real. The deeper question is whether the election image was enough to prove democracy. Chapter 3 of Manufacturing Consent argues that elections can be used as political theater. Chomsky called that these kind of elections as demonstration elections that are not only meant to choose leaders internally, but also to demonstrate something to an audience outside. In El Salvador, the audience was especially the US public and the US Congress. The message was American aid is supporting democracy, not terror. But outside the election photograph was another reality land inequality, military repression, massacres, murdered journalists, death squads, and an opposition that could not safely participate. So, throughout the presentation, we are going to ask one question again and again. What did the election image show, and what did it crop out? So, starting with the map, El Salvador is a very small country, but during the Cold War, small countries could become symbols of enormous global struggle. The reason the slide shows Cuba, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala together is that US policymakers did not see El Salvador in isolation. They saw it through what is often called domino logic. Cuba had a socialist revolution in 1959. Then, as Imtisal explained, in 1979, the Sandinistas overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua. Somoza had been a long-standing US-backed ruler, so his fall terrified Washington. If Nicaragua could fall, maybe El Salvador could follow. And if El Salvador followed, perhaps Guatemala or Honduras would be next. So when the FMLN launched a major offensive in 1981 January, Washington interpreted it through its Cold War fear. The conflict was not seen mainly as Salvadoran struggle over land, poverty, and military repression. It was increasingly presented as part of the Soviet-Cuban expansion into the Western Hemisphere. Inside El Salvador, the roots of the conflict were domestic land inequality, oligarchic rule, bloc elections, and state violence. But from Washington, the conflict became a global ideological battlefield. So, the tragedy of El Salvador begins with a double vision a local society experiencing repression and a superpower seeing a domino. When we see a ballot box, we automatically think of democracy. This is one of the most powerful political symbols in the modern world. A person votes, their vote is counted, and the people choose their government. But a ballot box does not exist in empty space. It exists in a political environment. So the basic question is not simply did people vote? The question is could people pose safely before they voted? Could people criticize the army? Could peasants organize unions? Could the left campaign without being murdered? Could a journalist report freely? Could priests denounce repression? Or could citizens refuse to vote without being treated as suspicious? Inside the frame, as we can see on the slide, we see voters, ballots, queues, and official results. Outside the frame are the conditions that make those images incomplete state of siege, death squads, murdered journalists, military power, US aid, and excluded opposition. So, this is the chapter 3 argument. The media does not necessarily fabricate the election, it focused on one real part of reality, the election day, and made it stand for the whole political truth. So, to understand why El Salvador reached civil war, we cannot begin in 1980. We have to go much deeper. And the deepest root cause is land. Spanish conquest in the 16th century violently reorganized indigenous land, labor, and power. After they gained independence in 1821, inequality did not disappear. Local elites inherited the state then. In the 19th century, coffee became the center of the economy. Coffee changed everything because coffee required land and coffee required cheap labor, and coffee created a class of powerful landowners whose wealth depended on controlling both. Point is that not coffee itself is violent. Point is that social order built around coffee required force to protect it. In the 1880s, liberal reforms abolished many communal and indigenous land holding systems. Land moved increasingly into private sectors. The economy became dependent on coffee exports to the US, while the rural majority became dependent on seasonal plantation labor. So before communism, before the FMLN, and before Reagan, before the White Paper, El Salvador already had a structure of extreme inequality. That is the root cause of the root cause. Conquest produced land inequality. Land inequality became coffee oligarchy, and coffee oligarchy required military protection. Military protection produced repression, and repression produced rebellion. This pyramid explains the society created by the coffee economy. At the top is the coffee elite. The phrase 14 families is often used to describe this oligarchy class. It is not often meant as a precise list of 14 families. It works as a symbol of how concentrated land and power were in El Salvador. The elite controlled land, wealth, banks, political influence, and often the newspapers and institutions that shape public life. In the middle of the pyramid are the army, police, courts, and state institutions. The middle layer is crucial. These institutions were not neutral referees. Historically, they protected the social order from above. At the bottom are the peasants, workers, and indigenous communities, the people whose labor made the economy function, but who had the least access to land and power. So, when the poor organized for land reform, or when the workers demanded rights, or when peasants formed associations, the state often treated these actions as subversion rather than citizenship. This helped them. This helps explain the violence later. Repression was not just a random cruelty; it was the enforcement mechanism of an unequal social structure. That is why the election story cannot begin at the polling station. It begins in the plantation order that shaped the state itself. This slide takes us to one of the deepest traumas in Salvadoran history, La Matanza, the massacre. In January 1932, during the dictatorship of General Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez, a peasant and indigenous uprising broke out in the western El Salvador. The uprising was linked to poverty, land dispossession, and political exclusion. It was also associated with Farabundo Marti, whose name later became part of the FMLN. The military response was brutal. Estimates vary, but commonly cited figures range from at least 10,000 to as high as 40,000 killed. But the number is not only the only thing that matters. What matters is the political lesson produced by the massacre. For the ruling class, 1932 massacre taught that mass violence could preserve the order. If the lower class rose up, the state could answer with terror. For peasants, it taught that organization could be fatal. Many indigenous people stopped publicly wearing indigenous clothing or speaking indigenous languages because identity itself had become dangerous. This is why the slide uses emptiness instead of graphic violence. The empty road symbolizes silence, disappearance, and fear. By 1980s, El Salvador was not inventing political terror from scratch. It had already inherited a political memory where massacre was a language of state power. Now we move on to 1972 because many Salvadorans lost faith in peaceful reform in that year. Jose Napoleon Duarte was a Christian Democrat. He was not a Marxist revolutionary, he was not a guerrilla commander, or he just represented a moderate reform, an idea that El Salvador could change through election without revolution. In the 1972 presidential elections, Duarte appeared to win. Then came a media blackout. After 3 days, the official results changed, and the military backed candidate Arturo Armando Molina was declared victorious. Duarte was arrested, beaten, tortured, and forced into exile. This moment is essential because it shows that electoral politics were not simply rejected by the left, they were blocked from the above. Imagine what this taught people. Even if a moderate Christian Democrat could win and still be denied power, then what change did peasants, unions, radical priests, or left wing parties have? The torn ballot box on the slide represents this collapse of the trust. The FMLN did not become plausible because elections were functioning normally. Armed struggle became plausible because peaceful routes had been closed again and again. On one side was state bloc, landowners, the military, conservative parties, and the US backed anti communist institution. Their language was order, property, national security, anti communism, and stability. To them, peasants, union leaders, students, priests, teachers, journalists, and reformers could easily become subversives if they challenged their existing order. On the other side was the revolutionary bloc that eventually formed around the FMLN. Its ideas came from several sources. Marxism gave a language of class. A small owning class controlled land and wealth while the majority worked in poverty. Socialism offered a program: land reform, redistribution, public services, and worker organization. Anti imperialism explained why many Salvadorans saw the army as dependent on Washington. Liberation theology gave religious meaning to the struggle, arguing that Christianity should defend the oppressed, not only preach private salvation. So the conflict was not simply democracy versus communism, which was the US government's preferred frame. It was also landless peasants versus landowners, social reform versus military repression, and political participation versus political exclusion. By the 1980, multiple revolutionary currents united into the FMLN, the Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front. This slide shows five streams merging into one river because the FMLN was not only one simple organization with a single origin, it brought together left wing guerrilla groups, Marxist intellectuals, peasant movements, student activists, labor organizers, and people influenced by liberation theology. The name itself reaches back to the Fabuna Manti, the rebel figure associated with the 1932 uprising. So even the name FMLN connects the 1980s Civil War to the older memory of land struggle and massacre. Now, we should be precise. The FMLN was an armed revolutionary organization. It fought a war. It received support from Cuba and Nicaragua. It was shaped by Marxism and revolutionary socialism. But the US frame often reduced it to foreign communist interference, as if the movement held no real Salvadoran roots. The reduction is misleading. Foreign support helped the FMLN, but it did not create land inequality, the 1972 fraud, 1932 trauma, or the death squad repression. The FMLN became possible because Salvadoran society had already made peaceful transformation seem impossible to many. In 1979, Nicaragua's Sandinistas overthrew the Somoza dictatorship. For many poor and left-wing movements in Central America, this was inspiring. It showed that the US backed dictatorship could be defeated. For Washington, it was alarming. The United States now feared that El Salvador might become another Nicaragua. This is why the dominant image appears again. The US policymakers imagined the region as a consequence of state that could fall into revolution. Cuba, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala. What followed, who knows? This fear shaped the policy. Once El Salvador was seen through this lens, the Salvadoran government became strategically valuable, regardless of its human rights record. The main question for Washington became this is not this regime is democratic, but can this regime stop the left? That is the moral danger of Cold War logic. Anti communism could transform a violent client into a necessary ally. So Nicaragua did not create El Salvador's internal problems. Those problems were already there, but Nicaragua changed how United States responded to them. It escalated US support for the Salvadoran state and turned the civil war into a proxy battlefield. In February 1981, the US State Department released a white paper called Communist Interference in El Salvador. The subtitle presented documents supposedly demonstrating communist support for the Salvadoran insurgency. The title itself is important. It tells Americans what the story is supposed to be about. Not land, not oligarchy, not the stolen elections of 1972, not death squads, not peasant poverty, but the official story becomes foreign communist aggression. Now, to be fair, external support for the FMLN did exist. Cuba and Nicaragua supported the rebels. Soviet bloc involvement mattered indirectly. But the key question is not whether external support existed. The question is what becomes the central explanation. By making communism the organizing frame, the white paper pushed domestic causes into the margins. This is why the slide shows redacted words around the document: land, oligarchy, death squads, 1972 fraud. Those causes were absent from reality. They were absent from the official frame. And once the conflict is framed as communist aggression, US military aid can be presented as defending democracy, even when that aid supports a repressive army. Romero was not a guerrilla. He was not a Marxist commander. He was the Archbishop of San Salvador. But he became one of the strongest moral voices against state repression. He denounced killings, disappearances, and the army violence. And he defended the poor. In February 1980, he wrote to President Jimmy Carter asking the US to stop sending military aid to Salvadoran government. His argument was simple. That aid would strengthen the forces repressing the Salvadoran people. On 24th March 1980, Romero was assassinated while celebrating a mass. This tells us something devastating about political atmosphere. If an archbishop could be killed for denouncing repression, what protection did a peasant organizer have? What protection did a union leader have? What protection did a student activist or a journalist have? Romero's murder shows the space for peaceful moral criticism was collapsing before the election ever took place. That matters because a real election requires safe civic space. Romero's assassination is evidence that even non-violent opposition could be treated as subversion. After Romero, the violence continued. On December 2, 1980, four US Catholic missionaries, Maura Clark, Ita Ford, Dorothy Kessel, and John Donovan, were raped and murdered by members of El Salvador National Guard. They were not guerrilla fighters, they were religious workers connected to humanitarian and pastoral work among poor and displaced. Their murder became internally known because they were US citizens. But that is exactly why this case is so revealing. Even if American missionaries could be killed by Salvadoran security forces, imagine the vulnerability of ordinary Salvadorans with no internal visibility, no US passport, no foreign press attention, and no diplomatic pressure behind them. The Salvadoran security forces could commit violence against priests, religious workers, peasants, journalists, and political organizers. The line between civilian life and suspected subversion had collapsed. So, when the later elections were presented as democratic progress, we have to remember the atmosphere leading into them, a society where even humanitarian religious work could become dangerous. Now we arrive at Mozote. In December 1981, the Salvadoran army at La Qatal battalion entered Mozote and surrounded villages in Mozaran. More than 800 civilians were killed. Many women and children and elderly people were killed. This was one of the worst massacres in modern Latin America history. But for this presentation, the most important thing is the timing. In December 1981, this massacre happened, and in March 1982, the election. Only about 3 months separated the two. So when we see later in 1982, the elections present through the language of turnout, courage, and democracy, Al Mozote forces us to ask what kind of political environment did those voters inhabit? The battalion was not only just a random criminal group, it was part of the Salvadoran military structure and had received US training. This matters because the same state being legitimized through elections was also conducting counterinsurgency violence against civilians. So El Mozote is not separate from the election story. It's part of the hidden background that makes the election image morally unstable. Massacre was reported, but then discredited. In January 1982, two major journalists reported the massacre: Raymond Bonner in the New York Times and Guillermo Prieto in the Washington Post. So the information existed before March 18, 1982. But the Reagan administration pushed back. It tried to discredit the reports, suggesting they were exaggerated or politically motivated. Later investigation confirmed the massacre, but at the time, the administration denial weakened the story's political impact. This is the key example of how propaganda works. It's not always about hiding every fact. Sometimes the facts appear, but official power changes its credibility. The story becomes controversial, the journalist becomes suspect, the massacre becomes a debate rather than the central truth. This is why this slide uses the word denied. The issue was not absence of evidence. The issue was whether evidence damaging to a US ally would be allowed to reshape the official narrative. In this case, the election image survived because the massacre evidence was pushed to the margins. 11 days before the 1982 elections, four Dutch journalists were killed by Salvadoran security forces. Their names were Koos Koster, Jan Kuiper, Joop Wilsum, and Hans Terlag. They were trying to report on the war, including areas connected to the guerrillas. The exact New York Times headline recorded for this case was Four Dutch Newsmen Slain on a Trip to Film Guerrillas in El Salvador. That headline matters because it shows that what they were doing. They were trying to see the part of the war that the official election image did not show. A free election requires a free pass, not just election day, but before the election day in the countryside, in the conflict zones, and among opposition communities. If journalists can be killed for filming the wrong side of the conflict, then the public image of the election is already restricted. The election photograph shown to the world was not simply incomplete by incident. The conditions for seeing were themselves dangerous. And if the camera cannot move freely, democracy cannot be fully visible. This slide gives us the wider evidence from the Truth Commission. After the war, the UN-backed Truth Commission collected around 22,000 testimonies. Its findings showed that roughly 85% of abuses were attributed to government forces, allied paramilitary groups, or Dutch squads. The testimonies included murder, disappearance, and torture on a massive scale. This is crucial because it stops us from treating the violence as a vague background condition or as simply equal on both sides. Yes, the FMLN committed abuses, but the dominant structure of terror came from the state and its allies. That matters for election. If the state is the main source of political terror, and that same state organizes or supervises the political environment, then we cannot judge the election only by whether people arrived at polling stations. The deeper question is, could people safely oppose the state they feared? Romero, the churchwoman, El Mozote, the murdered Dutch journalist. These are not isolated events. These are examples of a broader system of violence. This slide asks the central democratic question. El Salvador held elections, but these elections occurred under conditions of civil war, emergency rule, and fear. Herman and Chomsky emphasized that freedom of speech and assembly had been suspended under state of siege conditions. They discussed Decree number 5 of 7 of December 1980, which allowed the armed forces to hold citizens without charge or evidence for 180 days. That detail matters. An election is not just a single day, it depends on months and years of political life before that day. If people can be detained without evidence, if opposition organizers can be murdered, if journalists are unsafe, if critics are assassinated, then the act of voting happens inside a damaged political world. So when the slide asks, can election be free under siege? It is not a rhetorical exaggeration. It is asking whether formal voting can compensate for the destruction of the conditions that make voting meaningful. This is the difference between an election as a ritual and an election as a democracy. On the surface, the 1982 elections looked like a normal democratic event. Citizens voted, parties competed, the Christian Democrats, ARENA, and the PCN received vote shares. Turnout was reported at around 68%, but the election was a constitutional assembly, not a direct presidential vote. The president, Alvaro Magna, was selected indirectly by the assembly from candidates nominated by the armed force. That means the public vote did not simply translate into direct executive power. The military remained inside the process as a gatekeeper. This is why this slide shows the chain: public vote, assembly, military approved candidates, and Magana. The visible election produced numbers and legitimacy, but behind those numbers, the military still shaped what outcomes were possible. This is important because a managed election can look democratic while preserving real power behind the scenes. So the issue is not that nothing happened. The issue is that the election happened within limits already set by the armed forces. This slide takes us directly to media framing. The New York Times headline cited by Herman and Chomsky was Salvadoran jam polling stations, rebel close sum, published on March 29, 1982. CBS's Dan Rather gave election night line a triumph, a million people to the polls. Those phrases are extremely important because they turn the election into a story. The story becomes a brave voters want democracy, rebels try to stop them, turnout defeats intimidation, and elections prove legitimacy. But Herman and Chomsky point out several problems with this framing. First, no voter were killed and no polling stations were attacked on election day, and rebel military activity was actually below average. Second, the media heavily repeated claims of rebel disruption without properly grounding them in rebel sources. Third, the media did not foreground the coercive conditions around voting. So the cues may have been real, but their meaning was constructed. The media frame transformed turnout into democratic proof, while ignoring the possibility that turnout could also be shaped by fear, legal pressure, and survival. This slide actually compares El Salvador with Nicaragua, and this is the heart of chapter 3. Herman and Chomsky argue that US military applied different standards depending on whether the country was a US ally or US enemy. In El Salvador, a US backed client state, media emphasized election day mechanics, long lines, turnout, observers, ballot procedures, and army support for voting. But in Nicaragua, governed by the Sandinistas, the military media suddenly cared much more about deeper democratic conditions like press freedom, opposition access, army influence, political intimidation, and structural fairness. The problem is not that Nicaragua should not have been scrutinized. It should have been. The problem is that El Salvador was not scrutinized with the same seriousness. We even compare the voting procedures. In El Salvador, transparent ballot boxes and ID stamping were treated by some outlets as sign of anti-fraud seriousness. But in Nicaragua, greater attention was given to secrecy, literacy, registration, and voter protection. So the same standard was not applied across cases. For an ally, elections legitimized. For an enemy, elections were delegitimized. That is the propaganda model in action. This slide introduces the concept that ties everything together, the demonstration elections. A demonstration election is not only an election for domestic political decision making, it is also an election stage for an outside audience. In El Salvador, the outside audience was especially the United States. The Reagan administration needed to show Congress and the American public that the US support was not backing terror, it was backing democracy. So the election became evidence. Look, people are voting. Look, the army is allowing elections. Look, rebels are the one opposing democracy. Look, the US is helping democratic process survive. This is why election imagery mattered so much. The act of holding an election during war becomes a public relation achievement. But the chapter 3 asked us to look behind the demonstration. Who could safely run? Who could organize? Who controlled the army? Who had already been killed? Who was excluded by violence? A demonstration election works by making the ritual of voting standard in for the substance of democracy. That is exactly what Chomsky argued happened in El Salvador. This slide focuses on Roberto D'Aubuisson. He was not simply a normal conservative politician, he was associated with death called politics, and the UN Truth Commission later named him as having ordered the assassination of Archbishop Romero. This matters because it complicates the 1984 elections. On paper, the 1984 elections looked like a contest between Duarte, the Christian Democrat, and D'Aubuisson, the right-wing arena candidate. Duarte won with 53.53% of the vote, while D'Aubuisson received 46.41%. That looks competitive, but it looked like democratic choice. But the political field itself was distorted. The far right could participate, the modern moderate center could participate, but candidates to the left of Duarte were effectively outside the safe electoral field. This is why the slide links Debussy to Romero's candle. Violence was not outside the political system, it was inside. So the election cannot be understood as a normal contest of ideas. It was a contest taking place within a field already shaped by assassination, death squads, and military terror. This is why the Duarte's victory created an image of moderation, but it did not prove democracy fully. So the final stride brings us the whole presentation together. On one side, we have voter queues, turnouts, observers, election maps, official results, Duarte as a moderate civilian figure, headlines about brave voters, television language like a triumph. These were real, but on the other side, we have what was hidden or minimized. Land inequality, La Matanza, the stolen 1972 elections, Romero's assassination, the murder of churchwoman El Mozote, the killing of Dutch journalists, the Truth Commission's evidence of state responsibility, state of siege, ID card coercion, military influence, the exclusion of the left. These things were also real. The propaganda does not require us to say that the election image was fake. The stronger argument is that the image was selective. The media did not need to invent the election, it only need to crop the frame. So the final conclusion is this, that El Salvador was not an election without ballots. It was an election where ballots were photographed and fear was cropped out.
Thank you very much, Hassan. It was very comprehensive. So, if you can give us a one liner about the political and social conditions before 1984 elections in El Salvador and Nicaragua, what were the major differences between these two countries?
The main the main conditions in the both countries were very similar, but what differed was how the media portrayed it. Both countries were suffering from military repression and assassinations and oppression, but what difference is that how the media portrayed it. In one country, the media focused on these conditions that were absent, and on the other side, in El Salvador, the media focused on the positives of the election, like the voter turnout and the queues and how happy the voters were, and they represented democracy uh, as a saving mechanism from the repressive rebels.
Also, again,
Yeah,
as
go
I've
on.
gone through for the Nicaragua presentation, um, two major events happened which were very unusual for history. First of all, the Sandinista themselves accepted defeat, and they did not defend themselves against the U.S. opposition. And the second event was when the democracy was legitimate or not, it was not being discussed at all. The news did not talk about elections being fair or not. They shifted the whole narrative towards Soviet military expansion in Nicaragua.
Yeah, and I think in Nicaragua, before the Sandinista gave up and surrendered, Sandinista was pretty much like a government who was talking and working towards the welfare of the common people. And because they were working towards the welfare of common people, they became a threat, and they depicted that they have some soft corner for the Soviet Union. So that's why they became a threat for US, and that's why the way they depicted their elections were pretty they took a very critical eye towards their election compared to El Salvador, where the government is pretty much like US aligned government. And even though the situation was far worse in the country, yet they depicted the election as very fair and peaceful, despite the murders and the assassinations that happened throughout the country. Um, I think within that year. Sister Dabur, cool, go on.
Yeah, yeah. So I wanted to ask, what is the significance of plotting this like political picture, and how can we like relate it to today's times? That uh, like, what is the significance of this case study at large, if we wanna apply it to today's times?
If I could go on with that, because when I was covering Nicaragua, I did present Venezuela as well. It's a very recent event, and everyone knows about the democracy facing a lot of criticism internationally. When we compare these case studies with countries that are facing US opposition for gaining control, whether through elections or whether through dictatorship, what we see is US has a hold on media narratives, and the citizens are being controlled in a way that they make them understand what they want, and they make them think what they want. So reality is very subjective over here. Even if every country so basically, even if the country is facing the situation, there is no objective truth that has been given to the citizens.